Evan Sterling had made billions by avoiding risk, calculated, precise, and emotionally untouchable, until one ordinary morning, he watched two little girls struggle to push a wheelchair up a curb, and everything he thought he knew about his life began to unravel. Evan Harris was a man known for control. At 41, he had everything most people could only dream of, an empire built from precision, intellect, and sheer ambition. His suits were always pressed, his schedule booked months in advance, his emotions carefully rationed out, if they were shown at all. Evan didn't cry, didn't linger, didn't get involved. Especially not with strangers. Especially not with children. But that morning, as he stepped out of his sleek black car and walked down the pavement in front of his office tower, something stopped him. Not a sound. A moment. A human detail too out of place in his clean, calculated world. At the corner near the building's main entrance, two small girls were struggling to push a wheelchair up onto the high curb. They looked about 6 years old, identical in appearance, blonde hair pulled into loose ponytails, pale pink t-shirts smudged from the street, and wide blue eyes focused with quiet determination. They were trying to help a boy, slender, fragile-looking, maybe a year older, whose hands gripped the wheels while his legs remained still. The sidewalk sloped cruelly, and the chair tipped slightly backward each time they pushed. But the girls didn't stop. They braced themselves again and again, each attempt more desperate. Evan watched for a second longer than he normally would. Then, without speaking, he stepped forward and lifted the front wheels onto the curb with one smooth motion. The boy looked up, his face blank but not ungrateful. One of the girls nodded, her expression serious, almost protective. The other gave a tiny smile, unsure whether to speak. Evan hesitated, something tightening in his chest. "Where are your parents?" he asked, not unkindly but with the tone of someone used to hearing answers. "We don't have any," one girl said quietly. "We live with our aunt." The other added, "She's not very nice. She doesn't let us help Noah, but we do anyway." Evan looked down at the boy. Noah. He was pale, quiet, his hands resting calmly on his lap. His eyes were not pleading. They were accepting, as though he had already made peace with being ignored. "She says he's not our problem," one girl said. "But he's our friend," the other finished. "We help him every day." Evan stood there, frozen in place. He had heard tragic things in his life, stories buried under reports, statistics recited in board meetings, pleas skimmed over in proposals for funding. But he had never seen anything like this up close. Not so vivid. Not so small. 3 children working together without complaint, with more care and effort than most adults could bother to show. 2 tiny girls pushing a boy in a wheelchair up a curb taller than their knees, not because someone told them to, but because they couldn't stand to leave him behind. "Come with me," Evan said suddenly, shocking even himself. The children looked at each other. "Are we in trouble?" asked one. "No," Evan said. "You're going to have lunch with me." He didn't know why those words came out. He wasn't sure what he intended to do next. But when the 3 of them followed him into the building, tiny and out of place beneath the glass and marble lobby, he realized that this wasn't a passing moment. Something had already begun, and there was no going back. Evan guided the children through the lobby, past the gleaming marble floors and polished chrome elevators, ignoring the curious glances from security and staff. He was aware of how out of place they looked, 3 small children in worn clothes, shoes a little too big or too small, hair slightly unkempt from the wind and the weight of the morning, now surrounded by sharp suits and business chatter. Noah's wheelchair squeaked faintly as they crossed the tile, and the twin girls stayed close to his sides, their small hands never leaving the chair's handles. When the elevator doors opened, Evan gestured them inside and pressed the button for the executive floor. The girls stood silently in the corner, staring at their reflections in the mirrored walls, while Noah focused on the buttons with interest but said nothing. Evan watched them closely, not with suspicion, but with a kind of cautious curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't explain what had driven him to bring them up to his private office, perhaps it was instinct, perhaps guilt, or maybe something he wasn't ready to name. On the top floor, he led them into his office, a vast, glass-walled space overlooking the city. Normally, this room hosted high-stakes negotiations, private investor briefings, or silent phone calls with people who demanded more than they ever gave. Now, it was filled with 3 children who looked around not in awe, but with quiet, uncertain interest. Evan went to the intercom and told his assistant to cancel his meetings for the rest of the day and to bring in lunch, something warm and filling. The children sat down carefully on the leather couch. One of the twins, Amber, shifted closer to Noah and asked him if he was tired. He shook his head and gave her a faint smile. Emma, the other twin, sat straighter than her sister and kept her hands folded on her lap, her eyes scanning the room like she needed to memorize every escape route. Once the food arrived, macaroni and cheese, chicken tenders, juice boxes, and fruit, Evan didn't speak. He just let them eat. They were cautious at first, glancing at each other as if unsure whether it was a trick, but once they tasted the food, the hesitation faded. Noah was slower, careful with every bite, while the girls ate quietly but quickly. Only after their plates were nearly empty did Evan speak again. "What's your situation?" he asked, not coldly, but with an edge of firmness. Amber looked up at him first. "We live with our aunt. She doesn't like us talking to people." Emma added, "She says we cost too much. And that we're lucky to have a roof at all." Evan turned to Noah. "And you? The shelter?" Noah looked down at his lap for a long moment before replying. "They keep me in a small room. No one helps me shower. If I ask too much, they take my chair away." Evan felt the weight of those words press against him like a hand on his chest. He tried to imagine what it would be like for a child to be punished by having his mobility taken away. He couldn't. It was too much. "How long have you all known each other?" "We met Noah at the park," Emma said. "He was stuck by a broken ramp. We helped him move. And then we started meeting every day." "He's our friend," Amber said. "He makes us feel brave." Noah said nothing, but his expression softened. He wasn't used to kindness, that much was clear. It didn't come naturally to trust anyone, especially an adult in a suit offering lunch in a glass office high above the city. But there was something in Evan's face, in the steady calm of his presence, that Noah didn't flinch from. "I'm not a social worker," Evan said after a moment. "I'm not a hero. But I don't like what I'm hearing. If you were my children, I wouldn't let any of this happen." Emma looked up. "Then what would you do?" Evan stared at her, at all of them, and realized he didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in years, he felt like he wanted to find one. Something had shifted the moment he touched that wheelchair. And now, these 3 children were no longer just a passing moment in his day. They had become the beginning of something he didn't yet understand, but knew he couldn't ignore. Evan didn't return to work that day. He stayed with the children in his office, watching them as they slowly began to relax in the unfamiliar space. Amber curled up on one end of the couch and drew circles on the window with her fingertip, staring down at the people below. Emma flipped through a company brochure she found on the table, her brow furrowed as if she were trying to decode its business jargon. Noah sat in his chair, quietly observing everything, never speaking unless one of the girls addressed him directly. He was still, not out of fear but habit, the kind of stillness that comes from learning how to avoid being noticed. Evan had his assistant bring in some extra blankets and a few soft pillows, then quietly stepped outside to make a few calls. First, he called a private physician to come examine Noah. He didn't want to wait for a hospital to ask permission from a shelter that had already failed him. Then he contacted a lawyer, his most trusted partner, explaining the situation with clipped precision and requesting urgent advice on temporary guardianship. The lawyer hesitated for a moment on the line, then asked, "Are you sure about this?" Evan answered with a quiet, "Yes," before hanging up. When he returned to the office, he found the girls asleep on the couch, curled into each other like mirror images. Noah was still awake, but his head had tilted to the side, eyes half closed. Evan approached slowly, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to softness, to comfort. But as he looked at the boy, he realized how wrong it felt to send them back into the world they had come from without trying to do something, anything, different. The doctor arrived quickly and performed a gentle, thorough checkup on Noah, who remained calm but noticeably withdrawn during the exam. The diagnosis confirmed what Evan feared: Noah's condition had been neglected. There was evidence of muscle atrophy, pressure sores from inadequate seating, and emotional distress that went deeper than any chart could express. The doctor recommended immediate care and warned that any further delay could have permanent consequences. Later that evening, as the city lights turned golden and the office windows reflected a quieter world, Evan brought the children into a guest apartment he had on the same floor. It had once been a space for high-profile clients or traveling executives. Now it would be something entirely different. He helped the girls wash up, found them clean shirts from a closet stocked with spare clothing, and showed them how to adjust the lights and TV. Noah's chair barely fit through the bathroom door, so Evan made a note to have the space remodeled immediately. That night, the children slept in the same room, bundled together in one bed by choice. Evan watched them from the hallway, arms crossed, face unreadable. He wasn't sure what had come over him, but he knew this wasn't temporary. Something irreversible had started. These weren't just vulnerable children. They had dignity, intelligence, and a quiet kind of strength. He couldn't pretend they didn't exist now. He couldn't walk away. As he sat at his desk later, filling out the preliminary paperwork his lawyer had emailed over, Evan paused more than once, struck by how strange it felt to be doing something that wasn't for profit, advancement, or image. He wasn't rescuing them to look good or feel powerful. He just couldn't forget the way Emma had asked, "What would you do?" and how he hadn't been able to answer, not because he didn't know, but because deep down, he already did. By midnight, he had filled out everything. Name. Address. Reason for temporary guardianship. Under relationship to children, he hesitated, then wrote, unknown, for now. That part could change. The rest already had. The next morning began not with an alarm, but with the soft sound of laughter. Evan woke disoriented, having fallen asleep in the armchair of the guest suite just outside the children's temporary bedroom. He had stayed close in case they woke in the night or needed anything, and now, as the sun spilled through the tall windows, he could hear the muffled giggles of Emma and Amber from behind the door. There was a quiet hum of something unfamiliar, comfort. He opened the door slowly and found the two girls sitting on the floor beside the bed, braiding pieces of a scarf together, pretending it was hair. Noah was in bed, propped up by a pillow, still in his chair's cushion which Evan had placed beside him overnight so he wouldn't feel unstable. He looked more alert this morning. His face was still guarded, but there was a softness behind his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. Evan greeted them with a low, "Good morning," and they responded in unison, their voices shy but cheerful. It was strange to hear warmth in his own space, he wasn't used to it. He told them breakfast was on the way and excused himself to make a few calls. The first was to his assistant, asking her to rearrange his schedule indefinitely. The second was to a pediatric therapist recommended by the doctor who had visited Noah. He made arrangements for in-home sessions and mobility evaluations, then called a contractor and requested emergency renovations to widen doorways, install ramps, and replace the bathroom in the guest suite with one fully accessible. The man on the other end stammered in surprise. Evan had never once used the suite for more than one night. Now it was becoming a home. He returned to find the girls watching cartoons with plates of fruit and toast in their laps. Noah had declined the food, politely saying he wasn't hungry. Evan noticed he kept his body still, even when he spoke, as though movement itself came with consequences. Emma noticed too and casually offered to share her breakfast. When Noah finally accepted, she handed him a piece of toast with such ease, it was clear they'd done this before. After breakfast, Evan sat with the children at the small kitchen table in the suite and asked gently about their lives, what school they went to, who looked after them, and what they liked to do. Emma answered most of the questions while Amber chimed in when she remembered something important. Noah remained mostly quiet, but every so often he would glance at Evan, as if trying to gauge whether or not he could trust the man sitting across from him. Evan learned that the girl's aunt left them alone most of the day, that she rarely fed them properly, and punished them by locking them outside or in a dark hallway. Noah had once tried to speak up for them and had been thrown out of the house. That was how he ended up in the shelter, which was just another place that didn't know what to do with a child who couldn't walk. Later that afternoon, the social worker assigned to their case arrived. She had kind eyes but a tired face, as though she had seen too many stories like this unravel without justice. She spoke with each child alone, gently asking questions. Evan sat across the hall, tense but composed. He wasn't sure what the children would say. He hadn't asked them to lie or protect him. He had simply told them he was trying to help. When the interviews were finished, the social worker sat with Evan and sighed. "They trust you," she said. "I don't see that very often, not this quickly. But they do. Especially the boy. He's harder to read, but he watches you carefully. That usually means he's deciding whether or not to let someone in." She looked over her notes. "I think you already know this isn't going to be short-term." Evan nodded slowly. He did know. Somewhere between the curb and the couch, something had changed. Not just for the children, but for him. That evening, as the sun began to set, Evan found himself sitting on the floor of the living room with Noah beside him, watching Emma and Amber act out a story with plush animals. Noah hadn't spoken for hours, but then, out of nowhere, he whispered, "You don't yell." Evan looked at him and answered, "No. I never will." Noah nodded. That was all. But it meant everything. Over the next week, the apartment transformed in ways that were both visible and invisible. Contractors came and went quietly under Evan's instructions, widening doorways, adding railings, replacing furniture with pieces better suited to Noah's mobility needs. A therapy swing was installed in one corner of the living room for the girls, and the bathroom now had handrails and a specialized shower bench. The changes were practical, but the real transformation was subtler, an emotional shift in the air that no blueprint could replicate. The children began to move through the space like it belonged to them. Emma started humming to herself in the mornings while brushing her teeth, Amber began leaving her drawings on Evan's desk, and Noah, though still cautious, now rolled himself into the kitchen unprompted and waited silently to help set the table. Evan found himself adjusting just as quickly. He learned to make breakfast that didn't taste like cardboard and figured out which brand of cereal caused sibling arguments and which didn't. He no longer needed an alarm, the gentle whisper of little voices and the tapping sound of Noah's wheels on tile had become his new morning call. He took work calls less frequently and answered only the urgent ones. His colleagues noticed the shift in him, less tense, less sharp, still focused but somehow more human. They didn't know what had caused the change, but Evan didn't explain. It was private, something sacred he hadn't realized he'd been missing his whole life. The children began attending a local school part-time, and Evan insisted on personally dropping them off and picking them up. On their first day, Emma had clutched his hand tightly, Amber had made a show of being brave, and Noah had said nothing at all. But when Evan returned to get them that afternoon, all three ran, or rolled, into his arms, each in their own way expressing relief that he had come back. He realized then that they were still testing him, waiting to see if he would leave like others before him. So he made it a habit to always arrive early, even if it meant sitting in the parking lot for 20 minutes just to be sure. One evening, after a quiet dinner and a round of messy cookie baking that ended in flower footprints on the hallway carpet, Evan found himself alone with Noah while the girls took their bath. They sat in the living room, side by side, the TV on low but ignored. Evan was flipping through paperwork when Noah spoke softly, "Do you think I'll ever walk?" The question wasn't desperate. It was said with curiosity, not sadness. Evan set down the papers and turned to him. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I do know it doesn't make you less. Not walking doesn't take anything away from who you are." Noah stared at him for a moment, then nodded, as if considering the answer like a puzzle he was still solving. "I didn't think grown-ups said stuff like that," he said finally. "They usually just feel sorry." Evan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't feel sorry for you, Noah. I respect you. And I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Noah didn't reply, but that night, he slept without waking once. The next day, Evan received a call from the girl's aunt. Somehow, she had found out where they were. Her voice on the phone was harsh, accusing, filled with threats masked as legal concern. She demanded to see them, said he had no right, that she would sue. Evan didn't raise his voice. He simply said that every move he had made was documented and approved, and that any further contact should go through his attorney. When he hung up, he sat at his desk in silence for a long time. He knew what was coming. The peace they had found was fragile, and now it was at risk. That night, he didn't tell the children about the call. Instead, he helped Emma with her science project, complimented Amber's painting of their new family, and carried Noah to the couch to watch a movie together. They all fell asleep like that, piled on top of each other, tangled in blankets, the television playing to no one. And as Evan lay there with a small hand resting on his chest and the weight of trust settled across his shoulders, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever fight lay ahead, he would face it. Not because he had to. Because they were his. The storm began with a letter delivered by courier. Evan had been in the middle of helping Amber cut out cardboard stars for a school project when the knock came. He opened the envelope without urgency, assuming it was a document from one of his business partners. Instead, it was a formal cease and desist, filed by the girl's aunt. It accused him of unlawful custody, emotional manipulation, and threatened legal action if the children were not returned to her within 10 business days. At the bottom, stamped in bold black type, were the words, "Intent to pursue full guardianship revocation." Evan read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it on the table. He didn't show it to the children. Not yet. He simply returned to Amber, helped her glue on the last star, and kissed the top of her head. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Evan called his attorney. They spoke for nearly an hour, going over every signed document, every home visit report, every case file. Legally, he had done everything right, his actions had been within the bounds of temporary guardianship protocol. But family law was tricky. The aunt had blood ties. And even if she had been neglectful, a judge might decide that reuniting the girls with biological kin was more natural. Evan sat in the dark after the call, staring out the window, city lights flickering like distant warnings. He had done so much to build safety around them. But now that safety had cracks. The following day, he spoke with the children's caseworker. She had also been contacted by the aunt's legal team. She confirmed that the aunt was trying to present herself as reformed, claiming that she had entered counseling, cleaned up her home, and wanted to fix her mistakes. Evan could tell by the caseworker's tone that she didn't believe it, but that wasn't enough. Courts needed evidence, not instincts. So Evan began gathering every proof he could find. He requested statements from the school, from Noah's doctors and therapists, from neighbors who had seen the children thriving in his care. His staff signed letters confirming his devotion, the adjustments made to his life, the emotional investment they had witnessed firsthand. Despite the growing tension, Evan did everything he could to protect the children from the anxiety building beneath the surface. He kept their routine steady. He walked them to school, joined them at weekend museum outings, and read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that made them giggle. But it was Noah who noticed first. One afternoon, while Evan pushed him along a garden path outside the apartment building, Noah asked quietly, "Are we going to have to leave?" Evan stopped walking. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he knelt beside the wheelchair and looked Noah in the eye. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure you never have to go anywhere again," he said. "I won't let anyone take you if I can stop it." Noah nodded, but his hands tightened on the armrests. As the court date approached, the house grew quieter. The girls sensed the unease. Emma stopped asking for story time and began retreating to her room after dinner. Amber's usually bubbly energy dulled to a soft, careful watchfulness. Evan tried to talk to them about it, but they were too young to understand the details and too experienced in disappointment to ask questions. One night, he found Emma sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a half-finished drawing of their family. She looked up and said, "Do judges believe kids?" He sat down beside her. "Sometimes," he said. "But I'll be there to help them listen." When the day finally came, Evan dressed the children himself. He brushed Emma's hair into a neat braid, helped Amber pick a necklace, and fastened the small clip-on tie Noah insisted on wearing. The courtroom was stark, cold in color but not in tone. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a steady gaze, listened carefully to both sides. The aunt's lawyer presented photos of her newly cleaned home, a letter from her counselor, and claimed that Evan was using his wealth to emotionally bribe the children. Evan said nothing during the accusations. He waited. When it was his turn, he stood, voice calm and low, and spoke from the only place that mattered, truth. He described the children's conditions when he first found them. He explained the changes he had seen in them, the care he had provided, the way Noah had begun to believe in his own worth. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't perform. He told the judge that he had never expected to become a father, but that once he had, there was no going back. Then he stepped aside and let the letters speak, pages written in careful child handwriting, color drawings, school reports, all expressing the same idea: this is our home now. The judge took a long recess before returning with her decision. Her words were clear and unshaken. Temporary guardianship would remain, and the court would move forward with full custody proceedings in Evan's favor. The aunt's motion was denied. As the judge left the room, Amber broke into tears, not from fear, but from relief. Evan pulled her into his arms, then Emma, then Noah, who clutched his sleeve but didn't speak. He didn't have to. Evan could feel what the boy was saying in the way he didn't let go. In the days following the court ruling, the apartment no longer felt like a fragile shelter on the edge of uncertainty, it began to feel like a real home. The children, though still cautious in their own quiet ways, started to breathe differently. Emma resumed drawing, not just small pictures but full scenes of people, places, and imagined futures. Amber started asking again, hundreds of questions a day, silly and serious, some unanswerable. Noah smiled more. It was subtle, a slight curve of his mouth, but it lit up his whole face when it happened. Evan began to catch himself watching the children not because he was worried, but because he was simply in awe. One morning, Noah asked Evan if he could help him build something. Not a toy, but a ramp for the park near their building, one that was always too steep for his chair. Evan expected the boy to want him to call someone, to hire professionals. But Noah had drawn it himself, measurements and angles scribbled across a page torn from Emma's sketchpad. "I can't build it," he said. "But I can think it. I just need hands to help." Evan studied the drawing and felt a wave of quiet pride. He didn't hesitate. That weekend, with the help of a contractor and some volunteers, they built the ramp together. Noah sat nearby directing every move, pointing with a ruler and correcting angles with precision. The day it was finished, he rolled up it himself, no help, no pushing. The moment he reached the top, the girls clapped, and Evan looked on, heart too full for words. Life began to fall into rhythm. School in the mornings, therapy in the afternoons, family dinners filled with laughter and the occasional spilled juice. They celebrated small things: Amber's first perfect spelling test, Emma reading her first chapter book alone, Noah completing a week of physical therapy without skipping a session. Evan had never celebrated anything like this before. He'd thrown galas, toasted corporate victories, but nothing had ever felt as meaningful as watching three children overcome pieces of their past one day at a time. Then, one evening, something unexpected arrived. A letter addressed to Noah, with no return name, only a postmark from another state. Evan opened it cautiously and scanned the contents before giving it to the boy. It was from his biological father, a man Noah had only mentioned once before. The letter wasn't long, but it was cruel in its simplicity. The man wrote that he had heard of the court case, that he wanted compensation for years lost, and if he didn't receive a settlement, he would file for custody. Evan felt the heat rise in his chest as he reread it, not from fear, but from outrage. This man, who had never once been part of Noah's life, now saw an opportunity to profit from the family they had built. Evan didn't tell Noah everything. He handed him a gentler version, saying that someone from his past had made contact, and that Evan and the lawyers would take care of it. Noah didn't ask many questions. He just looked up and asked one thing: "Are you going to leave if it gets hard?" Evan crouched down, took Noah's hand, and replied, "There is no version of this where I leave. I'm not going anywhere. No one else gets to decide what happens to us, not anymore." Legal motions were filed immediately. The biological father had no case, no history of custody, no legal acknowledgement of paternity. But the fact that he had found them meant their little world was still vulnerable. Evan reinforced their security. He spoke with the school and made sure the staff knew who was and wasn't allowed to approach the children. He hired a second attorney, one who specialized in complex family protection cases, and he pushed harder for full and permanent custody, not because of a threat, but because these children deserved to know they were safe, officially and forever. That weekend, Emma asked if they could plant flowers on the balcony. Evan said yes, and they spent the afternoon elbow-deep in soil, placing marigolds, daisies, and bright red geraniums into pots along the edge. Noah helped arrange the layout, instructing which colors went where. At the end of it all, they sat together under the fading sun, the air filled with the scent of new earth and the hum of late spring. Amber leaned against Evan's side and whispered, "I think the flowers are happy now." Evan didn't answer. He just nodded and watched them, thinking that maybe, for the first time in his life, he finally knew what it meant to belong to something real. The day the adoption was finalized was quiet, almost unassuming, and yet it felt larger than anything Evan had experienced before. The morning began with Emma carefully laying out her favorite dress on the bed, smoothing the fabric with small, deliberate hands. Amber insisted on braiding everyone's hair, even Noah's, though it was too short, and Evan let her fuss over his tie until it was crooked but approved. Noah was quieter than usual, but not out of nervousness. He had been awake early, sitting in his chair by the window, watching the sky change colors while the others dressed. When Evan asked him if he was all right, Noah had simply nodded and said, "I just want to remember today exactly as it is." The courtroom was smaller than Evan expected. He had walked into hundreds of formal spaces before, high-rise boardrooms, federal panels, negotiation tables worth millions, but none had made his hands shake the way this one did. The children sat beside him at the long wooden table, legs too short to reach the floor, eyes wide but brave. Evan had brought their drawings in a folder tucked beneath his arm, not because the court required them, but because he needed a reminder of what was at stake. Pictures of them as a family, stick figures holding hands, houses with oversized windows, captions written in colorful, shaky letters, "Home, safe, Dad." The judge entered and greeted them warmly. She had reviewed the case in detail, every report, every testimony, every background check. She asked Evan to stand and answer a final set of questions. His responses were firm, but his voice caught slightly when she asked why he wanted to adopt. He told her the truth, that he never expected to become a father, that he didn't know the first thing about raising children until 3 of them showed up and taught him how. That loving them hadn't been a decision, it had been a transformation. She asked the children if they had anything they wanted to say. Emma reached into her backpack and handed the judge a crayon drawing of their new family. Amber whispered, "He makes pancakes now, even when he burns them," and Noah, after a long pause, said, "He listens. He always listens." The judge smiled, and for a few seconds, no one said a word. Then she leaned forward and announced her ruling: the adoption was approved. Evan Sterling was now, legally and permanently, their father. The moment landed like sunlight after a storm. Amber clapped her hands. Emma gasped and held Evan's arm. Noah's head lowered, and he smiled, not the quiet, careful kind, but a real one, full and unguarded. Evan closed his eyes for a second, overwhelmed, then looked at each of them and whispered, "We did it." They didn't leave the courtroom right away. They lingered, not because they had to, but because it felt like the room itself had changed. Back at the apartment, the celebration was everything the kids had imagined: streamers, cupcakes, a handmade, "Forever Family" banner hung with tape over the kitchen cabinets. Evan let them eat too much sugar and dance barefoot across the rug. When evening came, they all sat on the floor surrounded by empty plates and torn gift wrap. Emma curled against Evan's side with a book, Amber curled up in his lap, and Noah sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. As the sky darkened, Noah spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember what I said when you first helped me up the curb?" Evan nodded. "You didn't say much," he replied gently. "No," Noah said. "But I remember thinking, this is what safe feels like." He looked up. "And I was right." Later, when the children had gone to bed, Evan walked through the apartment and paused at the balcony where they had planted the flowers. The marigolds had opened fully. The air was warm. Somewhere inside, someone had left on a lullaby playlist. It played softly, filling the space with notes that felt like memory. Evan stood there a long time, not because he was avoiding anything, but because for the first time in his life, he had nowhere else he would rather be. He had spent decades building walls to keep people out. Now he had a home filled with small hands, laughter, and the one thing he never thought he needed, love, given freely and without condition. And he had no intention of letting it go.